How can we become part of God's coming kingdom? Welcome back to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Cosaert, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. Today we come to our fifth lesson in the book of Isaiah, and it's a rather large section of Isaiah for us. We've been covering over the last few lessons about one chapter at a time. We did chapter 7, chapter 8 last week, and this week we're looking at chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. So we have lots of ground to cover. And to help me cover that ground, I've invited my colleague and friend, Professor Brant Berglin, to join us here for Theology Sabbath School. So Professor Berglin, again, thanks for joining us. And let's go ahead and just jump right into the situation. I don't know about you, but when I looked at this week's lesson, I actually was a little overwhelmed because there was so much material. And it's really a rich passage with several prophetic elements of it. But when you get into the passage, it's really hard to kind of figure it out. So I thought maybe the place that I would begin before I ask you our first question is to set the context for what we're going to find in these chapters. So if you have your Bibles, I invite you to take them and open them up and turn to Isaiah chapter 9. And Isaiah chapter 9, we'll see in a second, is going to not be really where the context starts. Really, the context begins back with the chapter we looked at last week, chapter 8. And what we see in chapter 8, we see the coming of the invasion of Assyria. And it's a warning to the children of Israel, the children of Judah and the children of Israel, God's followers, that they are faced with a choice on how they will live, whether they'll be sent into exile, or whether they'll be part of the group that returns from exile. And then it goes from that into the promise of a born king. And that's at the end of chapter 9, verse 6. So you have this pattern of Assyria, invasion. How will we respond to those difficult times? And then this hope of this promised child. We have the same issue in the second half of our passage, which starts in in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 8. And it also then again mentions the invasion of the Assyrians. And it presents people with a challenge. How will they respond? Will they, go into exile, or will they be part of the group that returns from exile? So what's their trajectory? And then it ends with this promise of a child born to be king, a new royal king, a descendant of David in chapter 11. And then chapter 12 is a hymn of praise. So we kind of have two sections. So today we'll look at, start off with the first half of this, and then we'll look at the second half halfway through our lesson today. So with that context, let's go ahead and jump into our passage. And Professor Berglin, let's begin with Isaiah chapter 9. And it starts with this, "But there will be no gloom." Can you explain why chapter 9, verse 1 starts with this word, "but"? Can you explain what's going on here?
Yes, I think one of the important rules of prophetic interpretation that we have to keep in mind is that when we read the Bible, we can't read just a verse out of context. And if we look back just a few verses to the end of chapter 8, we'll see that same word was used there first in verse 22. It says, "Then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into outer darkness." Now, if we look at the original context of that phrase, we'll see that it's when people like Ahaz go looking for answers outside the God of Israel, when they go like King Saul did to look to spiritists and mediums and those who speak on behalf of the dead. Will there be no more gloom? God prophesies a time when that will come to an end. There will be no more gloom. I don't think it's just hyperbole. But perhaps Isaiah is overstating how serious the situation is for Israel. What do you think, Dr. Cosaert?
No, I don't think that's the case at all. The situation that the God's followers found themselves in was one of being invaded by the Assyrians and being carried off into captivity. And you kind of get that, like we discussed last week in chapter 8, that they're angry at God, they're angry at their king, they're looking up into the sky, but to them, they don't see an answer because they've hardened their hearts against God. And the exile that they're going into is going to be a brutal experience. We know that the Assyrians were not some sort of, paperweight threat. I mean, these were serious savages, warriors who took advantage of the people that they assaulted, robbed them. We have the Lachish reliefs, which is the depiction of the Assyrian conquest of the key Judean town of Lachish, and how they assaulted the town, how they pulled people out of the town, they impaled them on stakes, they tortured them, and then they carried them off as captives into Assyria. So we know the Assyrians were a serious, real threat. And the situation that the followers of God found themselves in here was one of real, dire distress. It was a horrible situation. And that's what makes it interesting here, is that while some are carried off into exile with no hope, that there's this promise here that there will be some who will see light. They'll see hope. They'll have optimism in spite of the reality around them. And that tells me this is not because they're downplaying the Assyrian threat, but it's because the followers of God recognize that there's a greater reality than the physical circumstances around them. That God's in charge, God is on his throne, and God will provide a way for his people to return. That although they are cast off into exile like their other compatriots, but there will be some who come back because their hearts are open to God, and they'll return. In fact, it mentions here in this passage that this time of this light, it says that in the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But these will be the first ones who also get the good news of this new exile, this new return. And that's what gives them hope, because they put their faith in God rather than the physical circumstances around them. Now, what's interesting about this passage is that there's a connection to the New Testament. And I know you really like the Old Testament, the New Testament use of the Old Testament, Professor Berglin. So can you tell us about how this passage is used by Matthew in light of the coming of Jesus?
It's very true. Matthew does quote from this passage in Matthew chapter 4, and he starts in verse 12 talking about Jesus when he heard that John the Baptist had been put in prison, that he moved up to the region of Capernaum to escape perhaps some of the persecution that would have been going on, or some of the fear for his ministry. And so he traveled up and lived in the Capernaum area, and Capernaum was around the north side of the Sea of Galilee. If you were to look at an allotment of the tribal lands for Israel, you'll see that Zebulun and Naphtali had tribal allotments north of the Sea of Galilee. And so when Jesus went and settled there, Matthew, in reading the story of Isaiah, sees in that story a fulfillment in Jesus Christ, that when Jesus arrived there to teach and to preach around the Sea of Galilee, that these lands that had originally or had been maybe taken over by Samaria and Damascus, that now they were being given a great light by the Messiah having arrived there as well. When we think about chapter 9, there's a lot of talk of hope and restoration. So Dr. Cosaert, talk to us a little bit about some of the language that's used there. Why did Israel have so much to rejoice about? What were they looking forward to in this ultimate redemption?
Well, it's interesting that you put it that way. What were they looking forward to? Actually, for them, it's a combination of looking backward in order to look forward. And what I mean by that is that the children of Israel would look backwards, and what was their anchor in their past was the experience of the Exodus. That God acted in a situation that seemed impossible, where there was no hope of redemption, no hope of salvation from their slavery in Egypt. God wrought this miracle by bringing them out by his mighty hand, defeating the Pharaoh, opening up the Red Sea so they could march through, and bringing them to the promised land. And so what happens is when God's prophets want to talk about the new work that God's going to do in the future for his people, they will always couch that language, that deliverance, in the language of the Exodus. And we have that right here in this passage as it talks about the people who walked in darkness see a great light. Well, the reason they're rejoicing is because this deliverance is coming. That the yoke that was placed upon them in Egypt, the same terminology used in Leviticus to describe the oppression that they had in Egypt. And a yoke implies suffering endured. That there's no hope, you're under the yoke, you have to endure. But God is going to break that yoke. So you have the terminology of a yoke, you have a staff that's used to beat animals, you have a rod that can beat people, you have the oppressor. And so you have all this terminology that's used of their enslavement in Egypt, and that God is going to break those powers. He's going to break the yoke and the oppression applied through the rod. He will break the rod. And so you have the description of a new Exodus here, that God is going to bring about a similar deliverance to the followers, his followers in the future, those who put their faith and trust in him.
You know, Dr. Cosaert, we have another reference to the Midianites here in verse 4. It says, "For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor." This recalls another story in Israel's history. Maybe you can say a word about that event.
Of course, this is the story of Gideon, who was the least likely of all possible candidates that God would work through, but that was the person that God chose. From the least tribe, the least person, and then Gideon himself is not a mighty man of valor. God calls him that, but his reaction, he's hiding when they find him. And God brings about a deliverance not with a mighty army, but with a small handful of soldiers that God worked through to bring about this amazing defeat of the Midianites, who were like the sand on the seashore, were conquered. It was the power of God that brought it about, not the power of Gideon. And we find that right here in this passage with this famous verse, starting in verse 6. And this provides the reason, or the means, I should say, the means of this deliverance. And again, it's an insignificant individual. That's how it comes across, because it says, what's the basis of this hope? For to us a child is born. Now, that's striking, because our hope's in a child. Now, if you remember, you and I, 2 weeks ago, we looked at Isaiah chapter 7, and we talked about another promise, another deliverance, where with King Ahaz, he had a sign given to him of a child. And so here we see again that motif, that theme of a child connected to God's deliverance. But this child, this newborn king, is an interesting individual because it has a number of titles. And first, that's kind of surprising. Why so many titles for this newborn king? Well, that's because kings in antiquity always had multiple titles. We think of some that applied in the Old Testament and the New Testament to God. He's King of Kings, he's Lord of Lords. You have all these different titles. And this newborn king also has a number of titles. You can look at them down in verse 6. The government will be on his shoulders. So it starts off, for unto us a child is born, to us a son is given. The government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called, and here you get all these names now, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness, from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So let's spend a few minutes to talk about this newborn child. What aspects do we see of who this individual is based on this description? The first thing I want to talk about, and I'll give you a chance to mention what you see here in this passage, is that first it's identified that this child, right, he's a son. So there's a humanity element to this individual. It's going to be a son, a born son, a child in this world. But then it's taken to a whole nother level. What strikes you about these other titles? What might these other titles indicate about the identity of this newborn king?
The first thing I notice in this passage are all the adjectives that are used to describe God, or in this case, perhaps the Son. The child that will be born is called a wonderful counselor. He's not just a good counselor, he's a wonderful counselor. He's a mighty God. He's powerful, he's strong. He's an everlasting Father. He'll be around forever. But I think my favorite adjective here is the one that we might say is the title Prince of Peace. You know, it reminds me of the story when Jesus was born and the angels showed up to the shepherds on the plains outside of Bethlehem, and there they proclaimed that Jesus of Nazareth would be the Prince of Peace, that peace on earth, goodwill to men, was to be publicized in light of the coming of the Messiah. And that to me is one of the most meaningful phrases, I guess, because we live in a world today where there is very little peace towards other people, often in our modern culture. And maybe there's some other aspects of these passages, some of these titles that you would like to point out as well?
You know, I find this reminds me just again of that passage in Isaiah 7. When you look at this, you say, well, is this really a divine prediction of Jesus, or, you know, is it rooted here? And what's interesting about it is that, I mean, although people talk about maybe this could be Hezekiah, the next king that would be born, but again, while it may have applied to Hezekiah in a limited sense at that time, there's no way he connects with all these titles. And the one that stands out the most, just like we saw Emmanuel, God with us, and you said last time we were together that title was never used of, you know, anyone in the pages of Isaiah, but it's applied to Jesus, of course. But what we find here is this description that this newborn king will be called a mighty God. And this is more than just saying, you know, he's going to be some sort of warrior hero. I mean, it's a mighty God. And this phrase, mighty God, if you have your Bibles, you can take and turn them to chapter 10 of Isaiah. In chapter 10, this same term is used in verse 21, talking about the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. It refers to him as a mighty God. And so this is a term that, like Emmanuel, shows us that there's more here than just some sort of earthly, historical, promised future, you know, child born to be king, but someone who's far greater. And that one, as you said, also identified as a Prince of Peace, that he is going to be someone who wages a different type of warfare, and under his reign there will be peace, that the war that has divided this world from its very inception will cease. And it says here that he will rule over the throne of David, and he will establish it, and it will be from this time forth and forevermore. Not a 4-year president, not some earthly emperor who rules for 50 years, but someone who will rule forever. And so for me, this points us far beyond Isaiah's time, but points to the ultimate redemption, the source of the ultimate exodus, the new exodus. And by God's grace, we are invited to be part of that if we put our faith and trust in this hope of one promised to be a king. So to me, fascinating passage. But let's go ahead and shift gears, though, because we have a lot to cover this week. Let's go ahead and shift to the second half of this week's study, which starts really in verse 8 of chapter 9. As I mentioned earlier, this again kind of resets the clock on this pattern that we saw earlier of the Assyrians are coming, they're bringing judgment upon those who have been taken advantage of the poor, of orphans, of widows, of the needy. But God offers a choice here on how people will choose to live. Will they live for Him, or will they live for themselves? And then he offers them the hope of another return from exile in chapter 10, verse 20. So you see kind of the same pattern. But then we come to, and I want to just pause here to read it just to show the connection. In chapter 10, starting with verse 28, we have this description of the assault of the Assyrian war empire upon the children of Israel, the children of Judah. And you see them coming. It starts off naming places. First he comes to Ayath, and then he comes to Migron. And it just keeps mentioning these names. And each of these places, if you look on a map, shows the Assyrians moving closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem. And in fact, it mentions in verse 30, "Cry aloud, O daughter of Gollum." And we know that war was probably the worst. Individuals who suffered worse from human war was the women, who were often the brunt of assault, taken advantage of. And here they're called to scream out because the Assyrians are coming. And we find the Assyrians at the very gates of Jerusalem in verse 32. And right there is when things switch, because this mighty power of Assyria, who has taken the axe and have cut down their enemies one by one, we're told in verse 33 that God promises that those Assyrians themselves will be cut down. I like how he describes it. "Behold, the Lord God of hosts will lop the boughs and the terrifying power." So he's cutting it down. "The great in height will be chopped down, and the lofty will be brought low. He will cut down the thickets of the forest with an axe, and Lebanon will fall by the majestic one." So God cuts down the mighty Assyrian empire and protects his people. And that leads us then to this next form of hope. How does this happen? And perhaps here you can jump in and talk a little bit about another tree imagery, another tree that's been cut down, but this one is a tree that offers hope and life. Can you kind of explain what's happening here in chapter 11, verse 1?
Sure thing. We have here a prophecy about out of the stump of Jesse, a branch will come up and bear fruit. We have this imagery all through the Old Testament where people are compared to trees. We see this in the first Psalm, for instance, where a person who keeps the law of God is actually considered like a tree planted beside a river, and it gets lots of nutrients and moisture, so it grows and flourishes, right? We also find King Nebuchadnezzar compared to a tree that when he becomes arrogant and haughty, he's cut down and he's given time to live as an animal, and then when he comes back to his senses, he recognizes that the God of heaven is a wonderful, great God. And so these people being compared to trees is used again here to say that out of the stump, that is, out of the ancestry of Jesse and David, then will come this new branch. The Davidic kingdom would give rise to a new king in Judah. Dr. Cosaert, maybe you can say something about the messianic prophecy that we have in chapter 11, and we can talk more about some of the imagery that we find there.
Yeah, again, I just refer back to what you mentioned here, this imagery of trees. And we saw this a few weeks ago. If you watched our lesson study with Dr. Matilda Fry in chapter 6. And this was the vision of Isaiah in the temple. And at the end, it talks about Isaiah goes out with this message and how everything's going to be cut down and destruction will come upon Judah and on Israel. But then it ends with this hope. As the trees begin to fall, it says, "But the holy seed," this is Isaiah chapter 6, verse 13, "the holy seed is its stump." So here this imagery of a stump connected to a holy seed. And here in chapter 11, verse 1, we see that becoming a reality. You have a stump that looks like it's dead, but this stump has life in its roots. And here we find again a connection to a promised king who's going to come from a time that looks like destruction, looks like there's no hope, there's no one on the throne of David, that there's life in the roots, and that those roots give birth to a shoot that comes out, and then from that shoot, a new tree grows, a branch comes out, and that branch is a new David come to rule over God's kingdom. And again, this messianic connection, there's a connection once again to the New Testament. I mean, the book of Matthew often draws upon these connections to the book of Isaiah. They see these inklings, these allusions to Jesus throughout the Old Testament that just jump out after they recognize who he is. And there's one here connected to an interesting fulfillment passage in the Gospel of Matthew. Can you tell us about how this one's connected also to the New Testament?
It's actually a really neat prophetic fulfillment statement by Matthew in chapter 3. In verses 21 and 22, he recounts how after King Herod died, Joseph and Mary returned back to the land of Israel, and they went north and they settled up around the Sea of Galilee region in the little village of Nazareth. And in verse 22, it says, "And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene." Now, you can search through all of the prophets, Isaiah and Ezekiel and Amos and Zechariah, and all the prophecies pointing to the Messiah in the Old Testament, and never once will you find a direct statement that said he would be called a Nazarene. But I find it interesting that Matthew here does not say a specific prophet. He just said through the prophets that he will be called a Nazarene. So when we read the Old Testament, we have to remember that Matthew is tying the place Nazareth to the prophecies in the Old Testament. And what we learn when we study the word Nazareth is the word Nazareth literally means the village or city of the branch. And what Matthew is doing when he's writing the story of Jesus is he's going back and reading books like Isaiah, and he's reading Ezekiel, and he's reading Amos and Zechariah, and he's seeing all the places in the Old Testament where the Jesus himself, the Messiah, would be described as the branch. And the Hebrew word for branch is natsar. And so here in the book of Isaiah, in chapter 11, where it says, "A shoot will come up out of the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch will bear fruit," Matthew is seeing this theme of the natsar all through the Old Testament, and then Jesus and his family go and live in the town of the branch. And he says, it's no accident. It's no coincidence. This is nothing but the inspired word of God being fulfilled in the life and ministry and person of Jesus Christ, even when he was too young to control it himself, right? Jesus was too young to tell his family he wanted to go to Nazareth to fulfill the prophecy. They went there anyways. But when we look at this passage through chapter 11 here and the first few verses, there's quite a few other characteristics of this king. What kind of characteristics does this king have that strikes you, Dr. Cosaert? What stands out for you?
Yeah, the one that stands out, there's a cluster here that certainly are worth our time and attention. And that is what qualifies this new Davidic king to be a ruler is the one that's mentioned in verse 2, where it says, "And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him." And this also is a really rich passage, because it's not just a portion of the Spirit, but it's the Spirit of the Lord. And here you also see a distinction. It's not just the Lord, but there's another kind of divine element here. It's the Spirit. So you have the Spirit of the Lord, and that Spirit rests fully upon this new Davidic king. And it's the presence of that Spirit upon this new Davidic king that enables him, that is from that base that we see these qualities begin to come out. And we're told that those qualities, those attributes, there are 6 of them, and they appear in 3 clusters of 2. And so it's like this: the Spirit of the Lord will be upon him. And because of that, then, we see here in verse 2, the Spirit, so it's, again, in my Bible, it's a capital S, it's referring back to the Spirit of the Lord. So it becomes a spirit of wisdom and understanding. So the ability to rule depends upon understanding your circumstances, your situations, and he has that kind of of wisdom and knowledge. It sounds a little bit, thinking back to like Solomon, the wisdom that Solomon had, that this new Davidic king will also have that kind of wisdom. Spirit also of counsel and might. So he has the practical skills to be able to rule. He knows how to wage war. We'll talk about the war that he will wage later. But he's mighty in that sense. He has wisdom, he has might. And then the third cluster, he has the spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And here again, these words are just pregnant with meaning. You kind of see there's so much more in them. When you think about that word knowledge in the Old Testament, and knowledge is like a sense of a full understanding, a full experiential knowledge. We see this in Genesis chapter 3 or chapter 4, where it talks about the birth of Cain. And it says Adam knew his wife Eve. There's this intimate knowledge that no one else really experiences, but Adam knew his wife. And here we're told that this new Davidic king has that kind of knowledge of the Lord, that there's an intimacy here that gives him strength and gives him wisdom, and that's what qualifies him. So again, we see as a tease, bits and pieces that say, wow, we knew that there was a promise of a new Davidic king that would come and who would rule on the throne of David, and we saw that in Isaiah chapter 9, and now we see it hinted here again in this new extra dimension that these words are rich. And he will have judgment. It says he doesn't judge by his eyes. He says he shall not judge by what his eyes see or decide disputes by what his ears hear, meaning that he doesn't simply go on what's apparent, but he's able to rule with a deeper sense of understanding, something that qualifies him to be a ruler unlike any other ruler that we've seen up to this point. And then we get this interesting passage, and this is where this is so rich, and we get this passage that talks in verse 6, that after talking, he's a God of righteousness and equity and justice, fairness for all, for the widow, for the poor. But in chapter 6, it moves to a new kind of description where it talks about this new ruler will usher in a new order of creation. And we have this long passage that talks about the wolf and the lamb lying down together. Can you kind of explain what's going on here with this description of this new order? I mean, we often get some of this imagery also in the book of Revelation. So what's happening here in this passage? What can we learn from it?
You know, one of the greatest hopes for Israel was that they could live in a land that was filled with peace and security. And when you think about the ancient world, they struggled with things like wild animals and predation. I lived in Alaska for a while, and when you went for a hike, when you went up into the mountains, you were always alert to there being wolves or bear or even moose, but especially the predators, wolverines. Those types of animals could be very dangerous for people. And so Israel was looking forward to a day when they didn't have to fear those animals. They had bears and lions around in their time. We know that because King David says that he slew one of each in protecting the flock. When we read further on in books like Isaiah 65 and other places in the Old Testament that talk about the lion and the lamb lying down together, and the wolf and the calf not fighting, the wolf not wanting to prey on the calf for food. This is the type of world that Israel envisioned, a world where predation and fear and pain were completely gone. And here's a shift then in language to what we saw back in Genesis, back in the Garden of Eden, where God is restoring the world back to a place of relative peace and safety, where we don't have the type of fear of death that we have that we still have today. And when we read the book of Revelation, we find that the book of Revelation ends up being the ultimate fulfillment of this hope, where God creates a new world without pain, without any crying, without any mourning, without any death. But I think there's probably more we could say about this passage. Maybe you could say some more about what this new world would look like.
Yeah, it is an amazing passage, and our time is quickly running out, so we'll kind of be brief here. But it also promises that this is not a limited order only for the Israelites. But here we find, again, this return from exile, right? Like a new Exodus experience is happening. And it's described in verse 11 that God will extend his hand a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people. And so God is bringing his people back. But his people here are not just described as being in Assyria, but they're described from being around the entire world. And so here we have a worldwide new Exodus experience, that people from every nation, kindred, tongue, tribe, and people, those who put their faith in God, who put their trust in him, who didn't live for the reality of this world, but lived their life in light of the world to come, that God will gather them together to be part of his new kingdom. And that sense of the inclusive nature of God's kingdom is a powerful description of what God wants to do, and I think a message for us that we also should seek to be inclusive, not falling into these old orders of reality that are divided by race and by nationality, by gender, by whatever, but that we seek to live under the new reality, starting today, of God's kingdom, which is a foretaste of the full kingdom that's to come. But before we end, there's probably one last thing we should say here. And this passage is beautiful, but the end is kind of difficult, because in verse 12, it talks about a conquest that the other nations will be put down, that against Edom and Moab and the Ammonites and the Egyptians and the Philistines, that God's going to lead his people in, this conquest. How do we reconcile this type of military language when I thought that, based on at least Isaiah 9, that this new Davidic king would be the Prince of Peace? So how do we reconcile those together?
Well, there's probably a lot we could say on the topic, and I know our time is short, but let me just summarize it by saying it this way. When we read through Scripture, we see that God's ultimate promise to his people is that he would restore them and that he would deliver them from their enemies. And I think we need to see the militaristic sort of conquest language in the context of God's covenant. He's made a covenant with his people. He's promised to be there for them, to protect them, to care for them. They are, after all, his bride. And when his bride is in danger, he has to come to her rescue. And so when we think about the language that's here in the Old Testament, as well as even the conclusion to Revelation, we see that God is coming to deliver his bride, his people. But I think that something that Revelation talks about that's important for this idea is that we see that even when he destroys his enemies, he does so with a sword that comes out of his mouth, right? He doesn't use swords made out of metal. It isn't the type of bloodshed that we might think about in normal battle. This is a transformation of the world through ideas, through the very word of Jesus Christ. I think ultimately the militaristic language is trying to explain the war for our allegiance. That is a war of life transformation, that we can be part of his new kingdom. The good news is we don't have to enter into any military warfare in order to become part of that kingdom. He does all the fighting for us. And in the end, all he asks of us is to have faith and trust that he'll take care of us and that he'll deal with our enemies in the best way possible.
I think that's an excellent way to wrap up today's lesson. So Professor Berglin, thank you for joining us. This was a rich passage and one that I think we could have spent a whole lot more time with, but we hope that just this little dabbling in it has encouraged you. And it's a reminder for us that as we look forward to God's coming kingdom, that we're called to live in light of that kingdom, not in light of the world around us, but we're called to wait upon the Lord, knowing that his promises will become a reality in the same way that these promises were fulfilled in the first coming. We await that new world order at the second coming of Jesus, and by God's grace, may that day come soon. So thank you for watching. Take care. We'll see you next week as we're back in the book of Isaiah. Until then, take care, God bless, and we'll see you next time.